All right, so welcome. We are going to be introducing topicality to you. Couple of objectives for this discussion. So we're going to be learning the parts of a topicality argument. We'll take a look at what a 1NC looks like and sort of go through the different parts. We'll learn how to answer topicality arguments. So we'll sort of take the perspective of the affirmative and look at what a 2AC should look like. We'll learn a couple of advanced concepts that are related to topicality. And then finally, we'll discuss common violations on this topic. The goal, of this sort of discussion is for us to become fluent with sort of what topicality is. So, you can leverage it during sort of the camp tournament and during the year. So, top level question, what is topicality? Topicality is a negative off-case position that determines whether the 1AC's plan fits within a topic. So to repeat that again, it's a negative off-case position that determines whether the 1AC's plan fits within a topic. How do you determine that? Well, you determine it based off of the topic statement, right? So the topic statement for this year is resolve the United States federal government should substantially increase its protection of the water resources in the United States. And the goal of a topicality argument is to see whether or not a plan would fit within sort of that larger topic, okay? There's sort of two important parts about topicality that you should keep in mind. Topicality arguments are about the plan text, not the advantages. About the plan text, not the advantages. What do I mean by that? So let's take one of the affirmatives in the let's see, the HL lab, for example. I believe there's an offshore drilling affirmative, right? The plan is about ending offshore drilling or banning offshore drilling. That would be topical, right? The question of topicality is not about the advantage. So for example, even if there's maybe a military advantage within the offshore drilling affirmative, that doesn't make that offshore drilling F not topical, right? It's not about the advantage itself, it's about the plan text, okay? Secondly, the way that you sort of determine whether something is topical or not is that you have to determine whether the plan fits within the topic statement by defining the terms within it. So one of the things that you'll sort of see commonly in a T violation is definitions of the word like substantially or increase or protection or water resources to try to explain why the affirmatives plan does or does not meet those resolution. Also, if there's at any point you have any questions, just feel free to interrupt. I am currently sharing screen, so it's a little bit difficult for me to see. So totally okay to just be like, say, hey, I have a question in the middle. And I'm also, happy to take questions at the end as well. Okay. All right, so there are 4 parts to a topicality argument. Okay, 4 parts to a topicality argument. Okay. First, there is an interpretation. An interpretation is something that establishes the parameters of the topic. Okay, establishes the parameters of the topic. Generally, when you are trying to interpret the resolution or the topic statement, you do so by defining one or more terms. That's sort of what we discussed a little bit earlier. So the negative will define some terms in the resolution. Okay. The second part of a topicality argument is the violation. The violation. The violation describes why the plan is not included in above parameters. So if the interpretation introduced some kind of definition of the resolution, the violation says that the plan doesn't meet that particular definition. The third part of a topicality argument is standard. The standard. Standards explain why your interpretation is the best one for the debate community to abide by. So, if you've interpreted the word substantially to be, over 50%, right? The standard is the section where you describe why that interpretation is the most predictable and the one that sort of the rest of the debate community should adopt. Finally, the fourth part of a T argument is the voting issue. A voting issue. Voting issues basically describe why the judge should vote on topicality. Why is topicality important? Why does it make the competition work? And why is it sort of a salient part of the strategy? So this is an example of what a T violation looks like. So this is a topicality argument about the word substantially. So you'll notice, right, the first thing that, is done here is there's an interpretation, right? I've interpreted, two things. I've interpreted sort of the amount of water that you might have, and I've also interpreted the phrase substantially increase as more than 50%, right? The goal being, I'm trying to sort of establish parameters for what should be within the topic. The next thing that you see there is violation. The plan does not protect 50% of US waters. It only protects Lake Erie, for example, right? If you were going to read P substantial against the Lake Erie F, you can have sort of a violation. So the violation, right, describes the plan as not meeting the phrase substantially increase as 50%. Finally, you see sort of a combination of sort of the standard of the voting issue. So I wrote voter for fairness, that's the voting issue. And then, made an argument that they limit to a bunch of different affirmatives. Maybe it, stops the negative from reading the state's counterplan, and having sort of more than 50% is good, right? So there's sort of a standard argument about why your interpretation is best. Does anybody have any questions up till this point? Just sort of the basic parts of a topicality violation and what a topicality violation should look like. Okay, we'll move on then. What makes for a good interpretation? Okay, so some interpretations and some topicality violations are better than others, right? The last sort of topicality violation I showed you, the 50% topicality violation, is probably not the best topicality violation. On the other hand, there might be some good topicality arguments about the definition of the word protection or the definition of the word water resource to limit out certain areas. So how do we decide whether something is a good interpretation or not? There's a couple of ways that you can think about it. First, you can think about the qualifications of the author that is being presented, right? So just like more qualified evidence in a non-T context is better than non-qualified evidence, right? Qualified evidence is good for sort of establishing an interpretation. Okay. Second, another way that you can sort of see whether or not an interpretation is good or not is based off of precision or field context versus ordinary meaning. So precision, field context versus ordinary meaning. There's a little bit of a debate to be had here, but folks will say that precision makes for a better interpretation. Are talking about sort of the set of authors that are interpreting a word come from a particular field and thus know sort of the lay of the land. So let me give you an example. If I had two definitions, one definition that was from a PhD of philosophy, and another definition that was from the Environmental Protection Agency, right? Although, both authors are qualified in their own way, the author that is speaking from the Environmental Protection Agency is probably more precise. They're writing in the context of environmental protection and probably the protection of water resources. So the precision and sort of field context there might be more important. Other folks sometimes will say ordinary meaning is more important. So some might say sort of you shouldn't just find sort of niche definitions. You should be looking for sort of the, definitions of the common person. That being said, my guess is that for a topic that is focused on, conservation issues, ecological science, my guess is that the set of definitions will be a lot more precise and field context related. Okay. The third way that you can have sort of a good interpretation is that you have an intent to define in the card. So, a piece of evidence that, has the word water, has the phrase water resources in it, but is casually talking in a sentence versus a piece of evidence that is like definition, water resources, and then defines the word. One of those is a better interpretation than the other. That's because the first, interpretation, which is just casually using the phrase water resources, doesn't really intend to define the term. It's largely just using it casually in a sentence, while the latter, which is like definition, water resources, has an intent to do so, right? Dovetailing with that, there's also the intent to distinguish or exclude. So definition that would be even better than just defining the word water resources would be one that tried to exclude the AF. So, if it's like definition, water resources include surface and groundwater. It excludes the oceans, right? That's something that intends to exclude, and you can sort of read that, against an oceans affirmative, and that's a great interpretation. Finally, a little bit fringe, but good interpretation should be grammatically correct. Or maybe you can sort of make arguments about etymology, but largely the sort of violation where this is relevant is its. So you might make argument that it is a singular possessive, so it can only be under the jurisdiction of the United States, for example, against the US-Mexico affirmative that the GG lab is reading, right? And those sort of can establish sort of a bright line for a good interpretation as well. Okay, let's talk a little bit about sort of standards. So we talked a little earlier that standards are sort of the why an interpretation should be adopted by the debate community, or why an interpretation is sort of the better one than the AFFs. There's a couple of things to sort of note here. Topicality is all about limits. Topicality is all about limits. This is actually something that Ken Strange, who is the former director at Dartmouth and also the DDI, used to say a lot, and definitely sort of resonates for this set of positions. So if debate's a research-centered competition that aims to give both sides an equal shot at winning, and the AF gets the first speech to present what area will be debated, there has to be some confines to what the affirmative can do for the negative to engage. This seems pretty natural, right? So, if you, decided to engage in policy debate, but there was no topic whatsoever, it would be a very difficult activity to engage, especially when negative, because you'll sort of have no idea what the affirmative can present, right? Limits are sort of an important part for, not only the functioning of competition, but also the quality of life probably for you. If you're a 2N and you were asked to cut case negatives to literally every idea on the planet, not on the topic, right? You'll probably burn out. It probably won't be a very effective extracurricular activity. In fact, it'll probably replace the entirety of your life, all of your sleep, and all the fun things that you do, right? So limits are sort of a pretty important facet of how we think about topicality, that there needs to be sort of a limit on the set of affirmative things can do. Are all limits good? No, not necessarily, right? So, there are some discussions about what makes for a good limit. So there's a couple of, key things. First, the limit has to be predictable. The limit has to be predictable. How do you make a limit predictable? Well, it's sort of the things that we had discussed a little bit before about sort of the quality of the interpretation. So, if your interpretation comes from a good source, it has the intent to define, it comes from, the Environmental Protection Agency, something that has field context, right? That makes it a predictable limit because it's a limit that is grounded in the field that is being discussed, right? So that's one way that you can sort of describe your limit as being a good one. Another sort of characteristic of what counts as a good limit is it must have a clear bright line for what fits and what doesn't. So let's say, for example, instead of substantially is 50%, I read an interpretation that says substantially is considerably, and the plan is not considerable. Well, that's not a very good limit or a very good interpretation because that doesn't have a very clear bright line for what fits and what doesn't, right? How do you determine whether something is considerable or not? On the other hand, water resources must affect 50% of the supply, right? That's a very clear bright line. There's a very clear number. If it's 49%, it does not fit. If it's over 50%, so if it's like 60%, it does fit, right? A lot of ways, there's also sort of qualitative ways that you can establish bright lines too, so it doesn't always have to be a number. Usually that's based on the intent to define and exclude. So remember back to when I was like, there might be interpretations that say water resources include surface and groundwater, but excludes saltwater. It's like, it's very clear about what fits and what doesn't. Anything related to surface and groundwater fits, anything related to saltwater does not, okay? Finally, a limit shouldn't underlimit, but it also shouldn't overlimit. So let me sort of define those terms a little bit quickly for you. Underlimit is the idea that there's not enough of a limit. So if I said, substantially is anything that is considerable, that seems to underlimit the topic because anything can purport itself to be considerable, right? On the other hand, it shouldn't overlimit so that there are not any cases that the affirmative can read, or like just like one or two affirmative cases that they could read, right? So if I was like, T substantially means you have to affect 100% of the water all the time. It's like, well, that probably would zap most of the affirmatives at this camp. It would zap the, US-Mexico AF, it would zap the offshore drilling AF, it would zap the environmental personhood AF that's about Lake Erie, it would zap pretty much all of AT's apps, right? So you want sort of a limit that straddles the line, that is a good middle ground, that is not like we allow all of the AFs, nor does it say we only allow one AF, okay? The way you sort of determine whether something over limits or under limits is based off of a case list. So usually when you're debating topicality and debating sort of these limits arguments, you will sort of come up with a set of cases that your interpretation would allow and a set of cases that your interpretation would not allow, okay? So let's say I was reading this surface water and groundwater interpretation. I might be like, the set of affirmatives that that would allow would be environmental personhood for lakes. It might allow for the US-Mexico AF, which is about the Rio Grande River, which is in fact surface water. It would allow for the CBA AF, which is the cost-benefit analysis AF that the AT Lab is reading. But it would not allow, for example, offshore drilling, because that probably affects a set of salt water because it's offshore. It would exclude atmospheric water because only ground and surface water is included, right? So you want to sort of establish sort of a case list that describes what sets of affirmatives you allow and what sets of affirmatives you exclude. Okay. Limits is probably the most important standard that we can talk about, and I think limits is sort of the thing that makes or breaks a topicality argument. And a lot of the other standards that we'll talk about right after this are very much sort of centered on limits. So a couple of other sort of key terms related to that. The word ground. Ground is the idea that there's a equal distribution, or at least an equitable distribution of arguments between affirmative and negative. Usually ground arguments will be like certain interpretations would exclude certain negative arguments from being read. So for example, let's say that I was reading a topicality argument about excluding tribal lands against the KM affirmative about tribal mining rights. Okay. I might make a ground argument there that tribes affirmatives are very difficult to beat with the state's counterplan, and are also maybe too small to link to a bunch of disadvantages, right? So unlike limits, which is about the size or the scope of what the AF can do, ground arguments are about whether or not certain negative generic arguments and negative topic specific arguments would link to an affirmative. Topic education. That is sort of what it sounds like. So, does a certain interpretation allow for more education or learning about a certain topic? Okay. Finally, this is more of a fringe one, framer's intent. So when it says framer here, a framer is basically somebody who wrote the topic paper. So for every topic, somebody sort of submits to the National Federation of High Schools a topic statement that and sort of an additional paper that basically describes the resolution and what should be debated on it. And sometimes teams will make framers intent arguments by looking at that topic paper and seeing whether or not that framer said they wanted to include a certain affirmative or not. That being said, I think these three standards are sort of inferior to a set of arguments about limits, or at least limits arguments tend to subsume them because all three of those standards derive from a limited topic, right? So, the ground arguments are only relevant insofar as, it would unlimit the topic to include a certain set of affirmatives that, skirt core controversies, right? So, if you've unlimited the topic to include a bunch of affirmatives that skirt the state's counterplan, right? It sort of proves that limits is sort of a prerequisite to understanding your ground claim. Or topic education, limits is also a driver of that, right? You can learn from anything functionally, but if you have too much to learn from, that leads to kind of an overstretch of your research resources, right? And it sort of proves that limits is a prior question to education. Or framer's intent is also based off of limits, right? It's based off of what should be within the topic and should not be within the topic. All right, some advanced concepts. So these might be phrases that you've heard before, maybe not, but hopefully, if you have, this is a refresher, and if you haven't, this is something that you'll learn. So there's a couple of different ways that you can say something is not topical. You could just say it's not topical. So like, for example, if I read the affirmative that the United States federal government should reduce its arms sales to Saudi Arabia on the water resources topic, right? That is just not topical, right? And you can make a topicality argument. There's two other sort of derivations of topicality arguments that you should keep taking note of. The first is the idea of extra topicality, abbreviated often as XT. The definition of extra topicality is that the plan has topical components, but also includes non-topical components. So the example that I have here is the United States federal government should protect aquifers and give citizens free healthcare, right? Statement 1, should protect aquifers, is topical. Give citizens free healthcare doesn't have anything to do with protecting water resources, right? The reason why extra topicality is objectionable is because a lot of times people will try to put in some extra topical components to establish an advantage. So, let's say I was reading this extra topical plan and I was like, advantage 1 is biodiversity and advantage 2 is public health, right? It's like, advantage 2 is coming from a non-topical component, and you can sort of make an extra topicality violation about that. The second kind of topicality that I kind of want to talk about that's advanced is effects topicality. Okay, effects topicality. The definition of that is that the plan is not topical, but its mandate results in topical action. Okay, so the plan is not topical, but its mandate results in topical action. So let's say that I read the plan, the United States federal government should ban cigarettes. It's like, banning cigarettes just conceptually is probably not a protection of water resources, right? But I have an advantage that's like advantage 1 is biodiversity. Cigarettes come from tobacco plants, and tobacco plantations hurt water quality. The hurt water quality hurts the water resources. It's like, it does end up in a topical action, but the initial plan that was presented is not topical, right? And you can read an effects topicality violation about that. You might be able to sort of think about extra T and effects T arguments in relationship to the affirmatives that we've discussed so far at the camp, right? So if you look at KM's AF about ICBMs and changing the pit production, one might say that that affirmative could be effects topical, right? So the plan about ICBMs is not really all that topical, but maybe it says that its results would be to protect the water resources that surround it, right? So you might make an effects topicality violation there. Or for extra topicality, I don't know if there's a very good example, but let's say that the US-Mexico water treaty sort of that establishes a binational water bank, right? That might have an extra topical component because not only does it have the United States jurisdiction over a water bank, but also Mexico. So you could arguably read an extra topicality violation against that. Does that kind of make sense? Hopefully it does. And just let me know if it doesn't. Does anybody have any questions up to this point? So I think we described sort of what makes for a good interpretation, what are some different kinds of standards, and then what extra topicality and effects topicality is. Sounds great. Affirmative answers is sort of what we're going to move on to next. Okay. So there's a couple of different kinds of affirmative answers that you should make in every 2AC. The first, did somebody, if you could just unmute and ask, that would be awesome because I think Emma.
Yeah, if an advantage, like about extra topicality, if an advantage isn't coming from like the extra topical part of the plan, can we still read extra topicality against it or no?
Yes, you definitely can. So if the plan itself, so let's say that, my plan that says the federal government should protect aquifers and give citizens free healthcare, I only read an advantage about aquifers. You can still read an extra topicality argument. Because remember, topicality is about the plan text. So is the plan text topical is the question, not is the advantage topical. Hopefully that helps. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Of course. All right, let's talk a little bit about AF answers. So these 4 AF answers should be in all of your blocks for the 2AC. The first answer is we meet. oftentimes abbreviated as WM. We meet arguments explain why the plan fits within the parameters the negative has described. Okay. Easy example. Let's say somebody was reading T substantial is 50%, and you were reading the WATEP affirmative from the Jensen Febrand's lab. It's like, well, that plan probably fits within the idea of 50% because it affects all waters of the United States, right? It affects 100%. So we meet, right? Second, you want to establish a counter interpretation, abbreviated as CI. A counter interpretation establishes alternative parameters for the topic. What that usually means is that the affirmative will present some counter definitions of the negative words. So let's say, talking back to the substantial is 50%, right? The negatives is 50%, and you have an F that doesn't meet 50%, but you think that the 50% standard is a little bit too stringent, right? You might have a counter interpretation that redefines the word substantial. So you might be like, substantial is actually just more than 10%, right? So what that does is it establishes alternative parameters for what the topic should look like. The third part, standards. This is one that you've seen on the negative side as well. So, if on the negative side, the argument for standards was to explain why a certain interpretation was better and should be adopted, that's true of your counter interp too. So once you've presented a counter interp like substantially is more than 10%, you should describe why your counter interpretation should be adopted by the community and is better than the negatives interpretation. Okay. And then finally, you can make a set of arguments about reasonability, about why the judge should be lenient towards the affirmative on topicality. I'll sort of discuss that more in detail because it's a little bit more complex than that, but we'll use that as a placeholder, which is why the judge should be lenient towards the F on T. This is an example of a 2AC, okay? So it includes, and this is a 2AC to sort of substantial is 50%. So there's a couple things that I did here, and I'm using sort of the Lake Erie environmental personhood example as an example. Okay, so the first argument I made was we meet. So we meet is an explanation of why the affirmative meets their interpretation of substantial. I made an argument here that the Great Lakes are the biggest water resource in the US. Okay, the second argument I made there is a counter interpretation that substantial means considerable and that we should not be quantifying for water. And then I read a card. So, if the 1 and C was like substantial has a 50% mark, this card basically says substantial does not require quantification in the context of water. Okay. So, I read a piece of evidence that redraws sort of the parameters of the topic. The next sort of two arguments, the argument that's like an over limits and it's arbitrary, those are arguments that are standards, right? They explain why my interpretation on the affirmative is better than the negative interpretation. So I've made an argument that they over limit. Remember, over limiting is that there's only, too few affirmatives. So it's like, only a few affirmatives affect over 50% of water. It would exclude core cases like CAFO permits, groundwater quality standards, because groundwater is not 50% of all the water in the United States, tribal lands, etc. Okay. The arbitrary argument. So, here I made an argument about sort of the quality of evidence. So I was like, the negatives evidence from earlier, the 50% card was from the United Nations calculating the supply of water, not necessarily the protection of water, which could be qualitative, right? So, making sort of an indict of their evidence. Finally, I've made a reasonability argument that's like, you should be lenient towards the affirmative on topicality questions. And that's sort of what a 2AC could look like. A couple of notes. Some arguments are better than others. So my guess is that the we meet argument here is not great because I doubt that the Great Lakes and just Lake Erie is 50% of water, right? But I did throw it out there. The counter interpretation is pretty good, and sort of the over limits and arbitrary arguments are pretty good. So there's sort of usually a mix of arguments that you're making in a T2AC. Second, sometimes T2ACs need to be longer. So in this case, I did not think substantially was that, threatening in the strategy. So I only had like 5 arguments, and the card that I read for the counter interp is pretty short. Okay. Sometimes you're reading an affirmative that is a little bit, on the fringe for topicality, and you need to sort of put together a longer T, 2AC. So, one AF where I would consider that is probably the ICBM's AF. Right. That AF is pretty clearly affects topical. So, my guess is that instead of just the, 5 arguments I threw out here, it's probably more likely that I'll have a 2AC that's likely going to be like a minute and a half long, as opposed to probably the 30 seconds-ish that it would take to read this section. Does that kind of make sense? So, 2ACs sort of aren't made equal and obviously depend on the set of quality of the violation being made and sort of, how close is the affirmative to the topic. Common affirmative arguments and some, terminology that's sort of associated with that. I'll sort of mention three. The first is the idea of over-limiting. So I think we just discussed this a little earlier. Over-limiting is the idea that a negative interpretation is too restrictive for affirmatives to survive on the topic. So, if an interpretation is like you only get 3 apps on the topic, that kind of overcorrects for the problem that we discussed earlier. Like earlier, I was like, oh yeah, it's so hard for the negative. If there was no topic, imagine, the quality of life of people just slaving away and, night trying to cook cards. Well, over-limiting creates the opposite problem, which is that the app has one affirmative and the negative just gets to do whatever they want, right? And that's pretty rough. Okay. Another sort of phrase that you might hear a lot is the idea of that it's arbitrary. Okay. That arbitrary exclusions are bad. This is sort of focused on, earlier I was like, a good limit and a good interpretation requires some precision. It requires intent to define. Well, sometimes you might be like their interpretation is very arbitrary. The definition is imprecise. Let's say that I read, a piece of evidence that says substantially can only be 100%, but it's from a court case about, somebody who didn't pay their taxes, and they were like, you need to, pay a substantial amount, which is going to be 100%. It's like, well, that definition is not in the context of water, right? So it's obviously pretty arbitrary, right? Sometimes, there might not be an intent to define, which makes it arbitrary. So let's say that I was writing a blog post and it said something like, we did a substantial, we had a substantial improvement in the number of students who attended the prom. More than 25% attended, right? And then you underline substantially is 25%, right? It's like that obviously didn't have the intent to define anything. That's just me randomly commenting about prom on my blog. Right. And I wasn't like the word substantial means 25%. I was just using substantially pretty colloquially. Okay. Finally, there might be some versions of this that are not so extreme, right? So sometimes there are definitions that might not be in federal context. So if the affirmative has a definition from the Environmental Protection Agency and the negatives definition is from the United Nations, right? It might be the case that federal context matters because the question of the affirmative is, the question of the resolution is, can the federal government substantially increase its protections? Not can the United Nations increase its protections, right? So perhaps the definition that is from the United Nations is more arbitrary and thus more unpredictable than one about sort of the federal government. Finally, another term that I think comes up a lot is the term functional limit. The term functional limit. The phrase functional limit is basically a set of arguments that are not based in the topicality violation being read that would basically naturally limit the topic even without your topicality argument. So in this case, I wrote down the affirmative allowing more cases is no big deal because there are common negative generic arguments that weed out the worst offenders, or there is no evidence to support the worst offenders exist. So two things there, right? There might be common negative generic arguments that answer the worst offenders. So you can say something like, the state's counterplan is a functional limit on the topic. Even if the topic is huge, the states can solve so many of those affirmatives that you don't really need to also say substantially is 50% to limit the affirmatives to a reasonable amount, right? Or maybe the privatization counterplan is also another possible functional limit on the topic. The second part of that sentence, or there is no evidence to support the worst offenders exist. Okay, so let's say that the other team started to generate a case list and they're like substantially has to be 50%. What if an affirmative says that the federal government should protect the Okeechobee River, which is in Florida? Okay, it's like there's probably no evidence to support that that argument. There's probably not a solvency advocate that says the federal government is the one that needs to go protect the Okeechobee River, right? So it's unlikely that those worst offenders exist, that the lack of solvency advocates or maybe the literature is the functional limit on the set of small affirmatives that exists. Before we move on to reasonability, does anybody have any questions about what affirmative arguments you need to make, what some of the vocabulary is, and what sort of the 2AC should look like. All right. Couple more things, and then we'll sort of do a question and answer. So we'll sort of talk about two paradigms for evaluating topicality debates. The first paradigm for topicality debates is reasonability. Okay, reasonability. We talked about this a little earlier. Usually the affirmative makes this argument and introduces it in the 2AC. There's a few different schools of thought on what reasonability is. For some people, it's just kind of a gut check. So it's just like, do I think this affirmative is topical? So, I'm reading, I'm watching a debate and somebody's reading the WATEP, and the 1NC was like, that's not topical. And the 2AC says you should be reasonable. Some people might be like, well, reasonability is just a gut check. It's just whatever I think is topical. I think that's the smallest brain version of reasonability. I think there's a couple of other ways that you can think of reasonability. The second way that some people think about reasonability is this affirmative debatable in this round? It's not about what's justified. So let's say that you were reading the atmospheric water AF from the AT lab. And the neg is like substantial means 50%. Atmospheric water is not 50% of the water that exists in the United States, because surface, ground, and coastal regions have more water percentage-wise. Reasonability arguments here might be like, well, the atmospheric water AF in particular is debatable, and we shouldn't have to debate about, whether like under 50% is justified. So, if the negative comes back and is like, your interpretation would allow the, Okeechobee River AF, it's like, the question of reasonability would say, it's not really like, we don't have to defend the Okeechobee River AF. That's not being debated here. The only thing that's being debated here is the atmosphere AF. So the only question should be, is this affirmative debatable in this round? Some people might sort of describe this as potential versus actual abuse. So some folks might say, you have to talk about abuse here in this debate, not sort of what potentially could have happened in another debate. Another way that people think about reasonability is that, reasonability means that affirmative defense is sufficient, even if the AF counter interpretation includes more cases. So AF defense is sufficient, even if the AF counter interpretation includes more cases. So by that, I mean, let's say that I'm looking at two interpretations. The negatives interpretation allows for, 10 cases, and the affirmatives interpretation allows for 12, right? For those of you who are diehard for limits, you might be like, well, 10 cases, smaller than 12 gives the negative more opportunity to engage, right? The AF could come back and be like, I mean, the difference between 10 to 12 is so marginal that it should not be sort of a reason to vote for it. So in this case, you can make a set of arguments that the defense that the affirmative is making. So for example, arguments about functional limits or the debatability about a certain AF is sufficient, even if, it might be slightly more under limiting. Does that kind of make sense? So, there's sort of different schools of reasonability. For me, personally, I think reasonability means sort of thing 3. I think for some people it means thing 2. Thing 1 is probably, not as great, but that's usually sort of how you think about reasonability. The other paradigm for thinking about topicality debates, and this is usually the one for the negative, is the idea of competing interpretations. Okay, competing interpretations. Competing interpretations is not about whether this affirmative in this round is debatable, but about the slippery slope the affirmative's interpretation justifies. Okay, so it's not about whether or not, so if we're talking about atmospheric water, and I said, substantial means considerable or whatever, right? It's like, the debate is not about whether or not the atmosphere AF was topical or not. The question is whether or not their interpretation would allow for a set of arguments that would be untenable for the negative. So if you were like substantial means considerable, it's like you can make the argument that's like, well, it would allow all these other cases. Okay. Usually under competing interpretations, you would evaluate T on an offense-defense paradigm. So I made the example earlier that's like 10 cases versus 12 cases. If you were evaluating T on a competing interpretations basis, you likely would come to the conclusion that the T violation that limited the affirmative to 10 is likely a better one than the one that limited to 12, because there's fewer cases that the negative has to engage with and has to sort of research, which would allow for more depth in the research that exists. Right. So, there's sort of two competing paradigms. There's obviously sort of different, benefits to one over the other potentially. So, for the affirmative, they might make the argument that competing interpretations, they'll use the phrase race to the bottom. The point being, at the point we're making sort of marginal differences between like 10 and 12 cases, it's like maybe a little absurd that we're making a topicality argument, or perhaps it's a little absurd that we are being held on trial essentially for all of the affirmatives they could allow, when the only thing that's being debated is whether or not this affirmative is topical, right? Versus, some people might say competing interpretations might be the only objective way to evaluate a debate. So, reasonability, usually is pretty vague, oftentimes kind of results in a set of gut checks. Maybe it's more objective, and maybe sort of reducing the number of affirmatives, even from 10 to 12, is something that is beneficial on a topic that is so affirmative leaning. So, there's quite a few ways that sort of people sort of debate the paradigms of these, and you'll likely see sort of these, operating in a set of 2 AC and 2 NC blocks. The final thing that I kind of wanted to talk about is just common violations on this water topic, and then I wanted to open it up to questions. So I think there's sort of 3 areas that are most fruitful for T violations that you're writing on the negative. So the first is the idea of the, what is protection, right, in the resolution. So protection is a term that's been defined in a bunch of different ways in environmental law. I'd say the most stringent way that you might sort of define it is it only a cessation of use? Is it only a cessation of use? Cessation means stop. So you basically have banned the use of certain water, right? You can see why the negative, might want to pursue that line of interpretation, because it would exclude a lot of the affirmatives on the topic, right? So, for example, the AT Lab atmosphere affirmative is focused on regulation of cloud seeding, which might improve the use of water in clouds. It does not end the use of those water, of that water, right? So, or if you were at the GDDI, the Water Markets Act would manage and conserve water. It's not a cessation of use. Okay. Another sort of, you can sort of go a little bit broader. You might say the protection is actually a regulation or standard on water quality, or maybe the management of water or distribution of water. That set of T violations is probably helpful against affirmatives that only vaguely affect water. So for example, the KM ICBM's affirmative, if you make a T violation that says protection only includes regulation and standards on water quality, it would certainly exclude that, affirmative, right? Because ICBMs affect water, but it's not something that is changing exactly the water quality standards or establishing a regulation on water or governing the water. It's actually governing ICBMs that have an effect on the water. Its effect's topical. Okay. Another set of violations that might be helpful is the phrase water resources. So you might have a set of cards that say it's just surface water, or maybe surface water and groundwater, to try to exclude affirmatives that are about the oceans, right? Or to exclude affirmatives that are about the atmosphere, just to make the topic a little bit more manageable. I think a big question here is there is some back and forth about whether or not water resources should include salt water. I think some people will say salt water is not a water resource. It's not a resource because you can't use salt water, right? So like you can't drink salt water. Salt water is not something that can be used for like, it needs to be desalinated to use, right? So it's not yet a resource, so maybe it's not included. There are some other definitions that say anything that essentially is water is a water resource. So they might have sort of a broader phrase that's like surface, ground, salt, and atmosphere. They're all types of water resources that exist in the United States because they could be used and they have the potential to be used. Final sort of common violation for this water topic is the phrase in the United States, in the United States. A couple questions to ask there. Is it just the continental United States? So there might be a set of affirmatives this year that doesn't just affect the United States, but maybe is specifying a certain territory or territorial sea. So I know for a second the AT Lab had considered putting together an affirmative about Puerto Rico or Guam. That did not end up getting written. But those affirmatives, right, are not in the continental United States. They're not the 48 states within the continent of North America potentially, right? So Guam is not necessarily North America, so it's not in the continental US. Okay. The second question might be, does the EEZ or the contiguous zone count? So this is a little complicated. The EEZ is an abbreviation for exclusive economic zone. And contiguous zone is sort of a subset of that. So to give you sort of a brief explanation of what those two things are, okay. EEZ and contiguous zone are a couple of miles into the ocean. And generally speaking, so from 0 to 12 miles off the coast, the United States unequivocally owns. It's US property, okay? Beyond sort of 12 miles, from 12 to 24 is what's called the contiguous zone. And then from 24 to 200 miles is called the exclusive economic zone. Okay, the contiguous zone and exclusive economic zone are not solely under US jurisdiction. They are regulated under international law. So the United States can operate their vessels in any of those places, but it is something that is not just under federal jurisdiction, but is also under the jurisdiction of the United Nations Convention on Laws of the Seas. And other sort of countries can sort of pass through the, potentially the exclusive economic zone. Okay. Finally, another question that you might ask for in the United States is, what about areas with co-jurisdiction? What about areas with co-jurisdiction? I think this affects, for example, the Environmental Personhood Act if it's still focused on the Great Lakes, or it would affect the Rio Grande, which is like all the US-Mexico stuff. The Rio Grande Basin is not just an area that has United States jurisdiction. A lot of it also has Mexican government jurisdiction as well. For the Great Lakes, it's under the co-jurisdiction of the United States and Canada under the, I think it's like the International Boundary Treaty or something. It's like the IBT or IWT. I forgot what it was, but there is sort of a treaty, organization and commission that sort of establishes co-jurisdiction for both of those areas. So you might make a set of arguments that in the United States means just the United States side only and not areas that have co-jurisdiction. So I think those are some common violations that you'll likely see this year. Okay, so that actually is the end of the presentation. Hopefully you learned a lot, and hopefully some of this was a good refresher. Does anybody have any questions? Or does everybody feel refreshed on sort of this idea of topicality, or feel like they learned something?
What is the best way to respond to like if you go for reasonability and they say that it's like requires judge intervention, there's no like standard for what reasonable means? How do you respond to that on the AF?
So there's a couple of things you can say. I would say something like judge intervention is inevitable, right? So even in deciding, for example, whether something has 10 cases versus 12 cases, it's like that also is a pretty arbitrary distinction that a judge ends up making, such all facets of debate have judge intervention, right? You might also sort of make the argument that reasonability isn't just a gut check. So, remember the sort of the two other things that I mentioned about reasonability? I was like, it also includes, for example, evaluating T on as defense is sufficient, not in an offense defense paradigm, or just deciding whether or not this affirmative is debatable, not whether all affirmatives are debatable. It's like, those are not decisions that are necessarily just gut checks. Those are made based off of the arguments that the other team has made and then arguments that you made in response, right? So it's not like the judge just intervenes and makes their own decision that is not based off of the debaters themselves. And then finally, I would make a set of arguments that, competing interpretations results in sort of arbitrary exclusions and shifting the goalpost. So, if you, let's say that you lost to T 50%. So now your affirmative is, 50%. It's like, if somebody did that, it's like, my guess is that the neg will come back and be like, well, actually substantially is 80%, right? It's like the next debate the goalpost will move a little bit, a little more. So you can make a set of arguments that's like, these arguments lead to substance spread out. You essentially just result in just, fighting over what is the most limiting, interpretation, and not necessarily what is the best for debating the controversy of water resources. Hopefully that helps a little bit.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yep. Any other questions? Okay, well, if you have any other questions that come up, just let me know. You can feel free to email me. My email is literally just my first name and then my last name @gmail.com. And happy to sort of answer anything that might come up. Thanks for coming. You have a 8-minute break until elective 2.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
of course.